I'm joined by the British entrepreneur Hugo Dixon. He is the principal architect of the plan to use Russia's frozen assets to make a loan for Ukraine. Hugo Dixon, thank you so much for talking to DW. We will get to the plan that you devised in a moment, but could we start with just a sense of what is the current status of these so-called frozen assets? Why are they in Belgium?
So these assets belong to the Russian central bank. And when Vladimir Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine in 2022, he left a chunk of them in the West. And the biggest amount was in Belgium. There are smaller amounts in other European countries and even further afield. But the biggest amount is at this depository called Euroclear, which is in Belgium. Initially, they were in the form of short-term government bonds, but over time, those have turned into cash. And that's why they're in Belgium. Now, what happened at the beginning of the invasion of 2022 is that not just the European Union, but the whole G7, the 7 large industrial countries, they decided to freeze all of the Russian central bank assets in their territories, in their jurisdictions. So it wasn't just in Europe, it was also in Britain, Canada, Japan, and the United States, and a few other countries.
We'll get to the details of the plan that you devised, but if you could just start by telling us how this came to you, right? When you started putting this plan together and how we eventually got to a place where it's been adopted by the EU Commission.
Yes, so very early on in the invasion, there were quite a lot of people who said it's not enough just to freeze these Russian assets. We need to confiscate them and give them to Ukraine because what Russia has done is illegal and Ukraine needs the money. And it's only right that they have the money. But that was not going to be politically possible. That became clear to me that was not politically possible. However, it is also clear that under international law, Russia owes war damages, also known as reparations, to Ukraine for its illegal invasion. And there is an international tribunal which is being set up after the UN General Assembly called for it to be set up, but it is going to take years before it comes to a final conclusion. The problem is Ukraine needs the money now, and this final tribunal judgment will be several years away. So therefore I came up with the idea of a loan to bridge the gap between now, when Ukraine needs the money, and sometime in the future when the final judgment will be handed down. And so that was the core idea. And the core idea behind this loan is it's a loan that Ukraine only has to repay if Russia pays it war reparations as it is required to do so under international law. And this is a way of getting around the political reluctance to confiscate the assets.
Right. And yet this has been a discussion for a few years now, as you pointed out. But just tell us a little bit about how you got to the stage where this is actually a plan that's on paper, that's been signed off by the European Commission, and now awaiting the decision of the EU's 27 leaders.
Okay, so last year, the first big breakthrough is I got a man called Lee Buchheit, who's perhaps the top sovereign debt lawyer in the world, and he helped turn this idea, which was a sort of like a journalistic idea, into a legally solid idea. And we got a man called Dilip Singh, who was in Biden's White House, and he is the person who developed the original sanctions package at the beginning of the war. And last year we had America on side, Britain on side, and Canada on side. But unfortunately that wasn't enough because the lion's share of the assets are inside the European Union, as we discussed, in Belgium. And one of the biggest objectors to doing anything ambitious with these Russian assets was Olaf Scholz, who was then the Chancellor of Germany. So the next big breakthrough that we had was the change of government in Germany. We had then expanded our international group, and we had on board former German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who's from the same party as Friedrich Merz, who's the new Chancellor of Germany. And so that was very important. And Berlin became an important supporter of the scheme. And then finally, the European Commission backed the idea of a reparations loan. Now, the version that they backed is slightly different from what we've proposed. It's not identical with our proposal, but the core idea is the same, that this is money which Ukraine only has to repay if Russia pays it war reparations as it is required to do so under international law.
Right. So the plan that's currently on the table involves taking the money from Euroclear. This is that Belgian institution, this financial clearinghouse, where the money is held. Give us a sense of what safeguards in your plan and in the plan that the Commission has now proposed. What are the safeguards that have been put there for Euroclear? Because we know that Euroclear is facing a number of lawsuits, the most recent one by the European Central Bank in a Moscow court.
The Russian Central Bank.
The Russian Central Bank, that's right.
The Russian Central Bank in the Russian court. Well, and that is against freeze that's saying that you shouldn't have frozen our assets at the start of the war. If the Russian Central Bank had a good case under international law, it would have moved 3.5 years ago. It wouldn't have waited until the week before this key meeting of European leaders. That lawsuit was an attempt by the Russians to scaremonger and to influence the decision-making at this key European meeting on Thursday and possibly Friday of this week. In terms of safeguards, we'll talk about the European Commission's plan. What they have come up with is that they've come up with a series of guarantees so that if by any chance, and it seems quite remote that Russia has a good case against this Belgian company, if by any chance they have a case and they win, that the rest of the European Union will rally round and will share the pain. They've also put in place a mechanism so that if by any chance these assets are unfrozen, say because of some political deal, and it's necessary to give the cash back to Euroclear, that the cash will be available. So these are the mechanisms that the European Commission has come up with. There are also other safeguards, a whole list of safeguards to protect Euroclear and to protect Belgium. And I should say, they've also said that the other countries inside the EU where there are frozen sovereign Russian assets will also be part of the scheme, even though it's a much smaller amount of money.
You just give us a bit of a quick crash course as to how this plan actually works in terms of moving the money from where it is and then eventually getting it to Ukraine.
Okay, so as I said, now the Russian assets have turned into cash. The cash is technically doesn't belong to Russia. It belongs to Euroclear, and Euroclear has an obligation to Russia to pay it money, but not this particular amount of cash. So the cash that belongs to Euroclear would be lent to the European Union, and the European Union would then lend it on to Ukraine with the proviso that Ukraine only has to repay it if Russia pays it reparations. So in the good scenario, where Russia pays reparations, money goes from Russia to Ukraine, Ukraine repays the loan, the EU gives the money back to Euroclear, and maybe the funds are unfrozen and the money goes in a circle back to Russia. But nobody really thinks that Vladimir Putin is going to pay war reparations. So he won't pay money to Ukraine. Ukraine won't be able to repay the EU. But the Russian account at Euroclear will be frozen. And so Euroclear doesn't need to ask for the money to come back. So everything will stay frozen. This is the European Commission's plan. It's a very ingenious plan. And last week, what they decided, not just the European Union decided to freeze these assets indefinitely, and that makes their scheme fairly solid. Up until last week, they were only frozen 6 months at a time, and that meant that there was always a risk that somehow it would be unfrozen and then Russia could get its money back. But that's not the case since last Friday.
Belgium is still strongly opposed to this plan. Belgium fears Russian retaliation, specifically targeted at Belgium. What do you make of the position in Belgium, which is a widely popular position? This is the opposition to this reparations loan for Ukraine using these assets. Is this just overly cautious on the part of the Belgians, or is there a solid case that this could have real repercussions for Belgium?
Well, I think that Belgium needs to be protected, and it's absolutely right to say that the rest of the EU must share any risk, even if the risks are small. If they actually materialize, there'll be big risks, and so it's reasonable for Belgium to insist on the risks being shared. But Belgium also needs to look at the big picture. And the big picture is that this is the most dangerous moment for Europe since the end of World War II. We have a threat in the East from Vladimir Putin, and we have our old ally, America, now run by Donald Trump, who is bullying us. And if Europe doesn't do something strong to support Ukraine, Ukraine will be forced to capitulate to Russia, and that will then undermine Europe's security, including Belgium's security. And Belgium should also remember, if you go back to the start of World War I, that started because Germany invaded Belgium, and the United Kingdom and others came to Belgium's rescue. And so now it is Russia that has invaded Ukraine, and Belgium should be on the side of small countries that want to maintain their independence in the face of foreign aggressors.
The European central banks also been very cautious about the reparations loan plan. What are the risks outside of Belgium fearing retaliation from Russia? What other risks are there, not just for Belgium, but for the Eurozone, as the ECB would be worried about?
Well, the European Central Bank has not said it's opposed to the reparations loan.
It doesn't support it.
Well, it's been much more neutral. What Christine Lagarde, who's the head of the European Central Bank, said is that this was the best version that she had seen. She was against confiscation, but as I was explaining, this is a loan. This is not confiscation. And when we look at the risks, the real risk to the Eurozone, the real risk to Eurozone assets and Eurozone bond markets is if Europe fails to support Ukraine. If Europe fails to support Ukraine and it becomes a vassal state of Russia, Europe's own security will be at risk. And then what will have to happen? Well, European countries will have to massively increase their defense spending above and beyond what they're currently going to do. And what are they going to do? They're going to borrow a lot of that money. And what's that going to do? That is going to cause huge strain in Eurozone financial markets. It's also quite likely, as Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, said last week, that if Russia gets its way with Ukraine, it will turn on another European country, perhaps a Eurozone country, such as Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. And if Vladimir Putin manages to gobble them up, that could be the death knell of the Eurozone itself. So we need to put these risks in perspective. The real big risk comes if Europe fails to support Ukraine in its time of need.
Countries around the world will be watching about this decision, right? What decisions EU leaders take on this reparations loan. What do you think that it signals?
I think that if Europe comes together and takes this decision to back Ukraine, the rest of the world will say, wow, that is the European Union doing something strong to advance its interests and that of its allies. If the European Union fails to do that, then there will be an impression that Europe is a bunch of losers, that is a group of herbivores in a world of carnivores.
What about the suggestion that this will signal that your money isn't safe in Europe, that what's happening to Russia, or what may happen to Russia with these frozen assets being loaned to Ukraine, could happen to you?
Well, I mean, if you're planning to invade a European country illegally and cause $600 billion of damage, and you happen to leave some of your money in Europe, I think you can expect that it will be frozen and it might be deployed in a loan to help the country that you've invaded. But I don't see Nigeria doing that, and I don't see Indonesia doing that, and I don't see India doing that. These are basically countries that are peace-loving countries, and they're certainly not going to be invading parts of Europe. I don't even see China doing that. So this is a one-off, very unusual situation. And certainly I don't see Saudi Arabia doing that, or one of the Gulf states that have got a lot of sovereign assets, or Singapore doing that. I mean, you know, this is not something that is usually done, is to invade a neighbor illegally and cause hundreds of billions of dollars of damage.
The US has its own plan for these frozen assets. Could you give us a sense of how it differs to what the Europeans are currently considering?
Yes, it's completely different. The European reparations loan would go to Ukraine, and Ukraine could use it to fund its defense. And that's the whole point of it. The whole point of it is that Ukraine would then have a much stronger negotiating position vis-a-vis Russia, because Russia would know that it's not going to win the easy way just because Ukraine runs out of money. The American plan is completely different. It is, once we've got a peace deal, then this money, a third of it, should go to Ukraine as part of a joint investment vehicle with America, of which the Americans would get half the cash. And the Europeans would throw in another $100 billion, but they wouldn't get anything from that. And the other two-thirds should go back to Russia. Again, with the Americans, somehow it's less specified, but somehow or other sharing in the returns of that. So it's a completely different idea. But the critical thing about it is that the American plan, at least as it was a couple of weeks ago, it's now being changed, amounted to capitulation by Ukraine. This was not about helping Ukraine get to a reasonable peace deal. This was basically about bowing and scraping, giving up territory to Vladimir Putin that it hadn't even lost on the battlefield. What the European plan is about strengthening the Ukrainian position and hopefully getting to a point where Vladimir Putin concludes that he's prepared to make a more reasonable deal, which will allow Ukraine to maintain its independence in the decades to come and not become a vassal state of Moscow.
As I bring this to a close, when the frozen assets, Russia's central bank assets were frozen, it was clear that the intention was to use these as leverage in an event where you're negotiating with Russia. So it's, I guess, two questions in one. The first being, what will this achieve, right? This reparations loan, and just give us a sense of how much of a moment this will be should EU leaders go ahead and sign off on this reparations loan.
This is an absolutely critical moment in European history. And depending on which way the European Union decides will depend whether the European Union is a player in its own future at a critical moment in history. So if it does this, it could be a game changer. It will make a huge impression on Vladimir Putin. It will make a big impression on Donald Trump, that Europe is a player. It will make sure that Europe has a seat at the negotiating table. It will also be very positive for Ukraine, not only because they'll have the money to defend themselves, but it will be a boost to morale, where morale at the moment is very weak. On the other hand, if Europe fails, this is a trump card, these Russian frozen assets. And if Europe doesn't use its trump card, Donald Trump will reach over the table and he will grab it for himself. And then he will bully Ukraine into capitulating to Russia. And not only will Ukraine be facing generation after generation of misery upon misery, but Europe's own security will be at threat.
Hugo Dixon, thanks very much for your time.
Pleasure.